现在的人有这么多的免费学习资源，那我们学得更快更好了吗？说到自学，很多人都会跟自己约定，每一天都要记得10个单字，或者是看 BBC News 30分钟。但是我们真的都 follow through 了吗？在这个单元，我们来聊聊必备的自学原则，让聪明的你学得更精准。Hello， 欢迎来到商业英语 Career Plus 的 podcast。在这边，我们利用多年国际职场与教学经验，带给大家最真实与贴切的职场英语知识。Hi, I'm Sherry, founder of Executive Plus. As a language trainer and certified coach, I've trained hundreds of managers from Fortune 500 companies such as Dior, Google, and Deloitte & Touche.
And I'm Nick, Director of Communication Strategy at Presentality.I've helped startups raise millions of US dollars in funding and trained executives of publicly listed companies to present on the global stage. Welcome to episode 14 of the Career Plus podcast. This week, we want to talk about studying English at home.Now, for years, when I was working with business people on improving their language, this is one of the most common questions I would get. Either they wanted to improve, to, work in their company, or a lot of people who had studied abroad or worked abroad and came back to Taiwan felt that they were regressing. And so they just really wanted to know, it's like, how do I keep up? How do I, study on my own and make sure that my language level stays higher?
所以像 Nick 所讲的，蛮多上班族其实对于自学这种方式都还蛮有兴趣，因为第一，时间非常的少，常常加班，所以你能够去 commit 到补习班的这种机会比较少。在第二，我发现就是蛮多人已经到某种程度，尤其是在学习商业英语上面，你会发现有很多大班，像补习班啊，或者是大班制的这种规模，已经没有办法去能够给你所需要的，因为你会发现你的需求跟其他人是不一样的，就算你们可能程度差不多，但是你发现你所需要的一些 information 跟 knowledge 是跟别人不一样的。
Right. So when it comes to studying on your own or studying at home, I always have two key pieces of advice. The first piece of advice is, are you interested in what you're listening to?A lot of people think like, I gotta study, and they pick up like a dictionary or listen to BBC.
Yeah.
Or they just find something that's very dry. Like if you're into the news, great. But if you're not into the news, believe me, having it on in the background makes no difference because you're not paying attention. Your brain is filtering it out. The second piece of advice that I give people is it's not about the media or the medium.I don't necessarily agree with cram schools' teaching structure or the way they look at language, but one thing that they do and that people do need is they need a structure. They need a lesson plan. So if you're going to study at home, it's not about setting goals. It's not about using things. YouTube, podcast, movies, there's a million things that you could do. But the question becomes is, what's the structure that you're doing it in?
所以有很多人其实在说到自学，他们第一个会想说，我要用 YouTube， 我要用 Podcast， 我要用哪一本书才能够帮助我？那其实我们都认为这个都是 This is not as important as just making a lesson plan for yourself. 你需要一个学习计划，你需要一个体系，你才能够 follow through， 因为这样子你才能了解到你真正的需求是什么。所以利用什么样的 YouTube, TED Talk 或 Podcast， 这些都是其余的，这些都是你可以随时去改变的。
And having a structure is the foundation for anything that you want to learn. Even now when we coach presentation and pitch,Most people ask, how do I get better? What's my stage present? Should I say too many times? It's like, step one is make an outline. What do you want to talk about? Think about the logic. And this is the same for building your English lesson plan at home. You need to think about the logic of where you are now and where you want to get. So Sherry, you do this a lot when you're either working private 101, but you either create a lesson plan or you entice people to start thinking about key questions for how they improve their English, right?Yeah,
and this mostly comes from my background in coaching. 因为我不敢说我自己是台湾唯一的语言教练，但是绝对是少数的。那因为我从教练这种逻辑思考的这种方式，我发现它其实可以帮助非常多成人在学习上面。因为 again 大家时间非常的有限，而且每个人需求都是很特殊，所以你一定要从这种了解你自己到底需要什么，这些很多不同的问题。你可以问自己，如果你要自己这样子做一个 lesson plan 的话，没有问题。You can ask yourself all these different questions， 让你了解自己到底必须现在要补充什么，而且给自己 set 一个时间，一个计划。
So if someone was to build this plan for themselves, what kind of questions or what kind of process do you think that they need to go through in order to build a more effective plan?
Right. So I think if you're going to do this by yourself and通常我都会跟我的客户经过大概2-3个小时的这种不同的 questions， 然后 interview 这种方式，我们可以拟定一个计划。但是如果你想要自己来做做看的话，没有问题。我这边有一些 questions， 你可以就开始可以自己问自己，然后自己做一些评估。那最前面2个 question 的 easiest ones are what's your strength and what's your weakness?In terms of language, you have to look at it from speaking, reading, writing, and what is that? What's the next one? Listening. 4 skills. You have to look at it from all different perspective. 很多人都会说我只想要练习那个听跟说就好了。可是呢，你会发现说有很多人因为他只想练习听跟说，他其实他的写跟他的读或者他的文法特别的需要加强，因为特别的弱，所以你要了解一下，评估一下到底你的强项跟弱点到底是在哪里。
Yeah, and just looking at a basic test score doesn't give you all that information.You know, someone who a lot of Taiwanese study for the test and they'll get certain scores, but that doesn't mean they can achieve that level. And there's a lot of people who don't have great scores because they were nervous, but they actually have very high achieving levels. So it's more about an honesty. It's like if I listen to, say, 30 minutes of something, how much did I honestly understand? How much could I summarize and repeat back to someone?
Yeah, so what Nick said was a really good point.Summarization, your ability to summarize what you've listened, let's say, it doesn't even have to be news, right? It could be just a TED Talk or even YouTube, right?
Yeah.
A 3-minute YouTube video.
Like some influence video on a new bag, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And what were the key features? Why did the influencer like it? Can you actually repeat or summarize what they were talking about?
Exactly. So,You know, they're back in the day, so 我看 YouTube 我最喜欢看就是 What's in my bag 我最喜欢看这样子的比较 fashion related 的这种因为这种都觉得看得很开心嘛。那 OK, so you watched a video, maybe 10 minutes, 10分钟的 What's in my bag from this influencer. Then you summarized. If you're able to summarize, then your logic and your thinking, your writing and reading ability is probably quite good.Another
thing that you can look at for strength and weakness is analyze what is your willingness to use that thing. So, for example, as someone who's grammar, they may feel, oh, my grammar is not great, but I am willing to go talk to anyone. This is a strength that you can utilize when it comes to building your plan. The reverse is true. Some people out there, their grammar is fantastic. Their grammar is better than even a native speaker, and they can explain all the words.But they refuse to write something down because they're worried if it's going to be okay or not, right? And these are factors that you can consider in when building this plan and evaluating yourself. It's like, what's your confidence level? What's your willingness to do something?
所以我们刚刚提到的这些都是你必须要去想，这些都是所谓你的强项跟弱点，并不是你的成绩。好像说你当初你的在 TOEIC 里面你的文法几分，你的 reading and writing 是几分，我们在讲的不是这个，我们在讲的是你实际上在使用这些语言的时候，你能做到哪一种程度。那如果比如说你是很注重文法的人，你觉得你文法很好，但是你很怕 make a mistake， 你反而在说的地方你就没有办法那么的流利。 Okay, this is something that you have to work on.
So what would be the next set of questions or the next set of thoughts that someone needs to go through when creating their lesson plan?
So after you kind of reevaluate your strength and weakness when it comes to language, you need to start asking the how questions. So number one, how much time do you have per day, per week to do the self-study? And you have to be very realistic. 这个部分就是你到底每一天或者是每个礼拜能够给自己多少的时间去做这种自学。那请大家一定要非常的 realistic。这个时候你不能说没有问题，每天我一定要1个小时。不管我会不会加班，不管怎么样，我一定1个小时。那如果你真的觉得你实际上觉得自己真正的能够 provide 10分钟，那你就说10分钟。
And a lot of these questions that you need to think about is not just like how much time do I want to study per day. This is about consistency. So don't say something like, oh, I'll study 3 hours a week. But that means that on Sunday night, in order to make my weekly quota, it's the same as studying any skill. This is about consistency every day spread out. But actually, I find that the last how question, how do you hold yourself accountable, is really something that people need to think clearly about.
And this is something that most people, probably 99.9% of the people, would not even think about. Like what do you mean, how do I hold myself accountable? 有很多人都会觉得说反正就做啊。但是其实你会发现常常你根本没有办法去 follow through 你自己给自己的一个 set 一个 goal， 因为太困难了，你可能想睡觉，或者是你实在想要 relax， 你想看电视，你不想管了。But how do you hold yourself accountable? 这个时候呢 maybe you can ask your family, ask your friend, right? Have a study buddy. 庆祝一下，如果你到达某一个程度，你也可以说我就可以 take myself out to a fancy dinner.
Yeah. Like you need to reward yourself or, I mean, some people go the punishment route, but I find that tends to work a little less.
Yeah.
Reward, set it up. Say something like, I'm going to give a speech in English. A lot of times building this, it's also good to build it around something that's going to actually happen so that you feel motivated to get it done. When we do presentation coaching or pitch coaching, one of the first questions we ask someone is when's the next time you need to get on stage and what do you need to talk about? And the whole reasoning behind that is because we're going to build all of our schedule around you getting on that stage.
Right.
It doesn't have to be that you're going to be perfect, but it's that you have this point that you're going to get feedback. Whether it's good or bad, it doesn't matter. You need to get on that stage.
So that's a really good point because that leads us into this another really important thing that we can ask ourselves is that do we actually have a short-term goal that we have to hit? 有很多人他可能现在他必须要自学，因为他知道在几个月之后他要出国做一个 business trip， 或者是他要做一个非常重要的 presentation。那这个就是你的 short-term goal。那你就会给自己一个 timeline， 所以 set a goal， right？ 什么时候要做这个 presentation， 然后你就倒回去说好，那我这样每一天每个礼拜我要给自己多少的时间，要学习多少，我才能够 reach the goal。
And actually setting both of the short-term and the long-term goal is great. Same in business, right? So if your short-term goal is this business trip, this presentation, that's a good way. But you also plan beyond that. Goes, okay, after I do that presentation and I can get my colleagues' feedback, I can check my boss's reaction, I can see whether, everything went through on that case, then I can look at my long-term goal. And so my long-term goal might be is that I actually want to become the spokesperson for the company. So I need to do all these small things in order to achieve my larger goal, right?
Yeah. 刚刚讲到很多，基本上就是你要了解你自己能够有多少的时间，还有呢，你有没有什么 short-term 跟 long-term career goal 是跟你这个语言学习是息息相关的。再来就是你要怎么确定你自己能够达到这个目标，你有没有给自己 set 一些 reward， 有没有办法给自己，或者是有没有家人或者是朋友能够帮助你能够达到这个 goal。What
would be the last set of questions that someone can really think through and consider when building this plan?
So I kind of mentioned that the friend and family, right? So I think it's actually really important to have someone there, maybe someone that you can practice with. It's the who question. So who can you practice with and who's that person that you can go to to make sure you're able to achieve the goal? And also, who can you go to when you actually do have questions? Because, when you're doing self-study, you're going to run into questions, right? Maybe it's grammar issues. 有时候发现某些字，为什么这一句是用这个字？那为什么是这个字，这两个字有什么不同？类似像这样的状况，就是你可以跟谁一起练习，或者是当你真的有问题的时候，你可以去问谁。
And this is going back to the resources that you would have at a cram school or you would have by finding a teacher that you're now removing from the picture when you're studying at home, but actually that function, you need to find a way to replace. Mm-hmm. So yeah, finding a colleague whose English level is great or a family member, it usually helps. I don't recommend necessarily going after your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend because that always ends up being a very different argument. But really finding a friend or a colleague that you can trust helps a lot in this, question asking process.
Yeah, I do think that your spouse and partner, they're not the best. They're not going to hold you accountable. Or maybe it will turn into some kind of pressure. So absolutely, have someone there so that you can talk to. And, if you do have questions, don't be afraid to reach out to your old teachers or, have schedule them one-on-one. 我发现现在蛮多类似像这样子一对一的老师，他可以不用非常 consistent， 比如说每个礼拜都要2堂课这样，他其实就是你有时间你上课，其实我觉得有这样子的方式也不错。
Yeah. So just finding ways to supplement what you're doing, both between self-studying and maybe finding some kind of coach or some kind of guidance, right?
Yeah. 我希望大家，那我们刚刚讲到说 OK， 我们了解自己的强项，自己的弱点在哪里，知道自己多少时间，自己有没有一些 short-term 或 long-term goal 你必须要达到，还有你要怎么样确认你自己能够做到这个整个 lesson plan。 再来就是这个有什么人你可以让他能够确认你是能够达到这个目标，再加上你有没有一个老师，你有没有一个相信的 coach 或老师，他能够回答你的问题。所以如果你都能够回答这些问题，那我相信你已经有个蛮初步的一个 lesson plan。
Well, we hope that you can take these tips and tricks and a little bit of guidance to start creating structure to your English learning. After you have that structure, go out there, have fun, find the YouTube videos, the things that you want to enjoy, and you'll find that by having this plan out, your English learning will increase much faster.
Absolutely. All right, so I hope everyone enjoyed the episode today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye. 如果你喜欢我们的 podcast， 欢迎来追踪我们的主管英文 Executive Plus 的 Facebook， 那也可以写信到我们的信箱 yourcareerplus@gmail.com。